you're right.
What the hell are you doing?
He's being a wanker.
Thanks.
What the hell is this?
Well, you know, bigger is always better.
Right.
This is my new 55-inch iPad Pro. Yes!
Unbelievable.
Wanker.
Is bigger always better? When it comes to what sample rate you should record at, many people think it is, with some esoteric music download services offering downloads at 192 kHz compared to the 44.1 kHz standard for the compact disc. I see an increasing number of tracks coming through to me for mastering at 96 and 192K as computing power becomes ever more affordable. Even this portable audio recorder is capable of recording at 192 kHz. But does a higher sample rate mean higher fidelity? Do high sample rates sound better? Spoiler alert, I don't think they do, and there's strong scientific evidence to back that up. Digital audio is actually approaching its centenary now, having been invented by British scientist Alec Reeves way back in 1937, so the technology has had time to prove itself. In this video we'll be looking at sample rate, bit depth, aliasing, trying to explain it all in an easy to digest format and answering one of the most common questions we get asked. What sample rate should I record at? So let's firstly bust some myths. Sample rate is the number of times an audio waveform is measured per second. It's measured in kilohertz. 48 kilohertz means that the audio is measured 48,000 times a second. 44.1 means that it's measured 44,100 times a second. There is a common misconception that higher sample rates equal finer resolution and therefore a higher fidelity and better sound quality. This misconception is particularly prevalent in the videography community, with many professional film and video makers taking on audio recording duties themselves, but without necessarily having a full understanding of the subject. And that's fine, but most people, even in the audio community, believe that sample rate of audio is akin to frame rate in video, and it just isn't at all. It's very, very different. Here's James with a brief explanation of how frame rates work in film and video.
When you go to the cinema to catch the latest movie, or chill out on the sofa in the evening to watch your favourite TV show, or even watch a video on YouTube, your brain is tricking you into believing you're observing a moving image. In reality, you aren't. You're watching a succession of still images captured and replayed in succession. The number of still images captured per second is known as the frame rate. Since 1927, the standard frame rate for film has been 24 frames per second. Film stock was, and still is, very expensive, and 24 frames per second was found to offer economic use of film, but be fast enough to trick the brain into believing the eyes were seeing a moving image. For video and broadcast in the UK and most of Europe, we commonly see 25 frames per second, and your iPhone defaults to 30 frames per second. And for gaming, most players like to hit frame rates of 60 or higher to become immersed in the most fluid movement. If we advance frame by frame through this video, shot at 25 frames per second, you can clearly see each still image as it was captured by the camera. If we advance frame by frame through the same scene shot at 50 frames per second, you can see the extra images that were captured, and it's no surprise to find out that for every second of video, there are twice as many. This can result in a higher perception of fluidity and greater realism, and you'll find that when you visit your local television store, the ultra high definition video that's looping on demo is usually created at much higher frame rates than the 24 frames per second of cinema, and can look stunning, although most real-world filmmakers and videographers agree that 24 or 25 frames per second just looks right in most situations. But what about audio? With your converters chopping up audio so many times per second, the higher the rate at which they do that, the better, right? Mark?
No, because digital audio works in a very different way to film or video. Audio digitizing doesn't chop up your audio however many times per second, it simply measures it. And that's a fundamental difference to grasp. With film and video, we get a succession of still images, effectively photographs, and nothing in between them. If I'm waving in front of a camera, frame 1 captures my hand there, and frame 2 captures it there. And there is no there There doesn't exist. It's an illusion, a trick of the brain with a combination of frame rate and shutter speed adding motion blur, just as we get with the human eye, to enhance that illusion. Audio works very differently, and yet this is the biggest myth in sample rate, and it's not helped at all by your DAW. Grace, load up a 1 kHz test tone at 48K in Logic Pro.
Okay, here you go.
So here we can see a 1 kHz test tone as represented by the DAW. The sine wave has been measured 48,000 times a second, and the DAW is translating those measurements 48,000 times a second to replay it. And here's what it sounds like. If we zoom into the waveform, we can get close enough in to see where the actual samples are occurring. We get a stair-stepped waveform. If we do the same at 96 kHz, we see this. If we compare the two, we can clearly see that the higher sample rate offers a higher resolution, there is less stair-stepping of the waveform, and the result is closer to the original sine wave. So a higher sample rate is better, right? Well, no. Let's listen to the tone at 48 kHz. And now at 96 kHz. They sound the same. And that's because they are the same. And here's why. You may have heard of the Nyquist theorem. This was a principle developed by a gentleman called Harry Nyquist and states that so long as the sample rate when digitizing audio is at least twice that of the maximum frequency or bandwidth being captured, then the original waveform will be captured and replayed perfectly. So let's put this to the test by loading up the waveform in Acoustica. Here we can see what is actually being reconstructed. If we capture a sine wave by sampling it at twice its frequency, we get a perfect sine wave. And if we double the sample rate, we get a perfect sine wave. If we quadruple the sample rate, we get a perfect sine wave. So what's going on in the DAW? Well, a DAW is a digital audio workstation. Its primary function is to capture, process and replay audio. What we are seeing on the screen is just a graphical representation of the waveform. The DAW is concentrating on processing the audio, not on giving us a stunningly accurate visualization. And this has other benefits attached. If we're trying to align phase by aligning two separate waveforms, it can be much easier to achieve if we have corners. In Acoustica, the primary job of the software here is to represent the waveform visually, and it's doing that rather well. So it's important not to be misled by your DAW here. If frame rate of film and video were to work as sample rate in audio does, the frame rate would have to be far higher and the image would morph between frames seamlessly. Bit depth is simply the resolution at which each sample is taken. We can understand this easily by looking at a sine wave and seeing sample rate, amount of measurements per second, on the horizontal axis, and bit depth, the resolution at which each individual sample is taken, on the vertical axis. The two most common bit depths are 16-bit and 24-bit. As the resolution of binary integers increases exponentially as word length increases, adding 1 bit doubles the resolution. Adding 2 quadruples it, and so on. Bit depth primarily affects the noise level from quantization error and thus the signal to noise ratio and dynamic range. It also affects the file size. A 16-bit system has a resolution of 65,536 possible values, whereas 24-bit yields a whopping 16,777,216. Without going into too much detail and diving into topics such as floating point dithering and noise shaping, one of the most important factors attaining to bit depth for the home recordist is that of dynamic range. And here is where we can look to the video world for a comparison. James.
Dynamic range in a digital video camera, such as this one, describes the ratio between the minimum and maximum measurable light intensities, black and white respectively, or shadows and highlights. In audio, dynamic range is directly comparable, literally the difference between the quietest and loudest signals. This is measured in decibels. 16-bit audio gives a theoretical dynamic range of 96 decibels, whereas 24-bit gives a dynamic range of 144. In video, a higher dynamic range means that you can simultaneously capture fine detail in shadows whilst in the same shot still retain detail in the highlights. In a camera with lower dynamic range, the highlights, or brighter portions of the image, would need to be overexposed in order to capture detail in the shadows, and therefore become blown out. Similarly, if you expose the highlights correctly, you'd lose detail in the shadows. On a camera with high dynamic range, you can retain detail in both. In audio, a higher dynamic range gives you a lower noise floor and extra headroom before clipping, and with most modern audio interfaces typically offering a maximum dynamic range of around 125 decibels, you're likely to distort the electronics long before you run out of digits at 24-bit. So it's generally considered that 24-bit is more than adequate for recording, and that with the 96 decibel dynamic range of 16-bit being roughly the equivalent to the difference between a fly farting in the corner over there and someone playing trumpet in your face, 16-bit is generally more than adequate for playback.
So hopefully that's dispelled some common myths and misconceptions, and armed with the knowledge that human hearing extends at its very best from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, the Nyquist theorem states that we need record with a sample rate no higher than 40 kHz in order to perfectly reproduce that. And that recording at 24-bit will give us a low noise floor and dynamic range that will exceed that of the audio interface or converters we're recording into. So why do many modern interfaces offer sample rates of 192 kHz and in some cases even higher? Higher is still better, right? Well, this is the subject of some debate, and many audio engineers will doubtless disagree with me here, but I believe that in most cases, recording at 96 or 192 kHz can actually make your audio sound worse. And here's why. What is aliasing? Grace?
Aliasing. Noun. The misidentification of a signal frequency introducing distortion or error.
So we know that a 40 kHz sampling rate in a perfect world will perfectly reproduce 20 kHz, the upper limit of a very young person's hearing. But we also know that we live in a far from perfect world. In reality, many musical instruments produce sounds and harmonics at 30 kHz and beyond, and ultrasonics are all around us. Just ask your dog. So are these sounds just ignored by sampling? No, they can also be converted but not correctly represented in the digitized output. When the signal is then converted back into the analog domain, false frequency components may appear that were not in the original signal we were trying to capture. This is aliasing, and as with dynamic range, again we can look to film and video for a comparison.
There is a very common phenomenon in film and video that I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, and that is that when we see footage of a spinning object, helicopter blades or the wheels of a car for example, they often appear to be spinning at a slower speed and in the opposite direction to that in which they're actually spinning. This is aliasing, misidentification of a signal frequency introducing distortion or error. In this case, the frequency being the speed of the spinning object and the error being that it appears to stop and then slowly start spinning backwards when it exceeds a certain speed. So what's going on here? Let's add a dot to a car wheel. If we have a frame rate of 25 frames per second, if the wheel starts spinning clockwise, then everything looks fine until we reach the frame rate of the camera. With the dot placed at 12 o'clock, when the wheel starts to spin at 25 revolutions per second, with a frame rate of 25 frames per second, the camera captures it at 12 o'clock in frame 1, 12 o'clock in frame 2, frame 3, and so on. When the wheel starts to spin faster than the frame rate of the camera, it captures the wheel at, say, 8 o'clock, 9:30, and 11 o'clock. But because the camera isn't capturing anything from 12 o'clock right round to 7:59, instead of it looking as though the wheel has travelled 70, 80 or 90% in a clockwise direction, it actually looks as though it's travelled 10, 20 or 30% in an anti-clockwise direction. Similarly, in digital audio, aliasing means that what we can't hear can negatively affect what we can hear. So how do we combat that?
Quite simply, all we need to do is filter out any frequencies above the Nyquist frequency, half the sampling rate, the maximum frequency we wish to capture. These filters are known as anti-aliasing filters. Now this was easier said than done back in the days when filters only existed in the analog domain, as all filters have an inherent roll-off slope. This means that either the filters were letting in frequencies above the Nyquist frequency, allowing aliasing distortion to occur, or were sloping down beyond the Nyquist frequency and rolling off the signal within audible range. And that's why in the early days of digital audio we saw sampling rates slightly higher than 40 kHz, CD at 44.1 being a perfect example. This allows the filters a 2.05 kHz transition band, that's half the additional 4.1 of 44.1, in which to do their thing. So back in the days when CDs were the most common consumer format, I typically recorded, mixed and mastered at 24-bit 44.1 kHz. The 24 bits gave me additional headroom during the production phase, and files were dithered down to 16-bit during the mastering process to send to the replication plant for CD production. Dithering is the process of adding a form of low-level noise to an audio signal as it's rendered to a lower bit depth in order to mask or randomize what's called quantization distortion, and it's probably beyond the scope of this video and is really only relevant for CD production these days, as most delivery formats are online and work at 24-bit, which requires no dither. And there's a very strong argument for recording at 24-bit 48 kHz today. That is the required sample and bit rate for most of today's delivery format providers such as Apple Music and Spotify, as well as being the standard for television, film and video worldwide. So today I work at 24-bit 48 kHz. So why have devices such as this one that record at 192 kHz? There must be some advantage, right? Look, we even get an intriguing high-res sticker. Well, the sticker gives the game away. The answer largely is marketing. This is the Tascam DR100 Mark III. The Mark II only recorded at a maximum of 96K, and the Mark I a mere 48. Sad times. Now I know of at least one person that thinks this sounds better recording at 96K. There's something less digital about it, he will enthuse. And he'll also state that it must be because of the higher resolution. But it's not because 96K is giving you twice the resolution of 48, as we now know that it isn't. It's because the converters at 96K in this unit aren't very good. And at 192, they're even worse. They're a marketing tool. At 48 kHz, it sounds fantastic, and that's because it's very difficult and very expensive to design converters that work accurately and sound good at vastly different sample rates, which is why the 2-channel mastering grade audio converters found in a high-end mastering facility can be one of the most expensive tools a mastering engineer has to invest in. What's happening with this at 96 kHz is that we're introducing non-linearities and aliasing effects that are being brought down into the audible range. At 48K, we're filtering out everything above 20K. Ultrasonics we humans can't hear are getting filtered out. At 96K, we're not filtering out anything above 48. And at 192, things get even worse. These ultrasonics can become a real liability. Another argument for not using super high sample rates is because playback systems, speakers and amplifiers also introduce distortion into a signal, and this distortion increases rapidly at higher frequencies. If an amplifier and speaker system designed to operate within the range of human hearing has to also reproduce ultrasonics at the same time as audible frequencies, any non-linearity will shift some of the ultrasonic mess into a pebble dash of distortion that can appear across the entire audible spectrum. And this is why so many people claim that recording at 96 kHz can sound more analog. It's because of the distortion added by converters and playback systems that are designed primarily to operate only within the range of human hearing. So before we wrap up this video with some audio examples, I can sense loads of you who have been doing this a while screaming at me, but my plugins sound so much better at higher sample rates. That's why I record at 96 or 192K. And you're right. Many nonlinear plugins such as compressors and saturators, that is plugins that add extra harmonics to a signal, can introduce aliasing in the audible range at normal sampling rates. That is because the extra harmonics introduced can increase in frequency at a much faster rate than the original signal, and once they hit the Nyquist frequency can become reflected back down and appear as unwanted distortion within the audible range. This again can result in a pebble dash of unwanted distortion, albeit at a low level, and the cumulative effect can have undesirable phase implications that might give the distortion we actually want from the plugin a thin or fizzy sound. This is often interpreted by people as sounding digital. At a higher sample rate, these harmonics have a far greater ceiling as they head towards the Nyquist frequency, and are therefore reflected much later at a much higher frequency, and are reflected back down way above the audible range, leaving just the distortion we are adding. But most plugin developers are aware of this problem, and well-designed plugins oversample internally. This means that the signal that goes in at, say, 48 kHz will be oversampled many times, often up to 384 kHz, before being downsampled back to 48 again once the processing has taken place. On some plugins this can be switched on and off and may appear as an HD mode, and some do it entirely automatically outside of the user. But if you just record at 192 anyway, doesn't that negate the need for internal oversampling? Well, yes it does, but then the audible aliasing and distortion can be introduced by the capturing process as we outlined earlier, and running a project at 192 kHz as opposed to 48 also increases the storage required, as well as the processing power required of your CPU by a factor of 4. So it's generally accepted by most audio professionals that recording at 48 kHz with a bit depth of 24 yields the most accurate results in terms of sampling, with any intermodulation from plugins adding extra harmonics taken care of by their internal oversampling algorithms. There's an excellent video on this subject by plugin developers FabFilter, who also conclude that recording at 24-bit 48 kHz and using oversampling is the best option for music production, and we'll link to that in the description. So let's wrap this video up with a quick audio test. Grace, load me up a project that was both recorded and mixed at 96 kHz and make it good.
Okay, loading up a cover of Ain't No Sunshine by The Goodbye Look. Would you like AES tones to test the quality of your converters at the same time?
Yes please, and good choice of track. So here we're going to perform a basic null test. What a null test proves is whether there's any difference between files. If you play an audio file and duplicate the audio file and flip the polarity so as it's 180 degrees out of phase with the original one, then they will completely cancel out, and the only thing you'll hear is the difference between the two files. Before we do that, we need to test our converters at 96K. So here we've got two sets of AES test tones, and we'll link to these in the description so you can download them for yourself. And this will show us whether our converters are up to scratch. So at 96 kHz, you'll see activity on the meters, but we shouldn't be able to hear anything. If we can hear something, if we can hear a lot of digital noise, then we know that our converters aren't up to scratch at 96K and should never, ever record using them at that. So this is the first test tone. So that's good, so we can see it in the meters there, but we can't hear a sausage. That's brilliant. And then the second one, this one tests for intermodulation distortion in the converters. So let's play that. Click on the channel, there we go. So again, we can see loads of activity in the meters, but we can't hear a thing. So that means our converters are up to the task of recording and playing back at 96 kHz without any artifacts that they may be introducing. So here we've got the original mix. So this track was recorded and mixed at 96 kHz. So we can play you a bit of this. Let me just put the loop on so as it cuts to a bit where we get going.
I wonder this time where she's gone.
And then on channel 2, we've got a duplicate of the file with the phase reversed. So in isolation, they all sound the same.
Ain't no sunshine when she's gone, and she's always gone too long.
So if anyone says to me that they can hear a difference between these two, you can't, because if we play them both together, they completely cancel out, and we can see on the output meter that there is nothing at all. So that proves to us scientifically beyond all doubt that these two files are absolutely identical. If I go to this one and take off the gain plugin, which is reversing the phase, you'll hear left channel and right channel come back in. That's flipping the phase, it's cancelled out. So these two audio files are absolutely identical. So let's compare 96 with 48. Here's the 96.
I wonder this time where she's gone.
Here's the 48.
I wonder if she's gone to stay. Ain't no sunshine.
Can you hear a difference?
And she's always gone.
I can't, and again, this proves it. So I can't hear a thing. Here's our 96 playing, here's our 48 playing, and I can't hear a thing. But interestingly, here we have got some activity on the output meters. So that means that there's something going on in the ultrasonics that we can't hear. So something is being put out by Logic Pro, but it's out of the range of human hearing. Now that's interesting, because if we compare that with the 96 file, again the two files cancel out, but we get, let's click on one of those so you can see that the track's still playing, we get nothing at all on the output meter, absolutely nothing. If we swap that with the 48K, then we still can't hear anything, but we do get activity on the output meter. So there is something going on. So now let's compare the 96
And she's always gone too long.
with this, which is 16-bit 44.1. So not only is this at a much lower sample rate, but it's also at a much lower bit depth. This is giving us a theoretical 96 dB of dynamic range, whereas the 48 and the 96 are giving us 144. Let's just swap between the 96 and this one. Again, I can't hear any difference between those. So let's play them both together. And once again, they completely cancel out. We can still see some activity on the meters. In fact, we can see a little bit more than we saw at 48K. So there's definitely something going on in the ultrasonics here, but we can't hear anything. So there's proof pudding, if you need it, that there is absolutely no advantage whatsoever to recording at higher sample rates. In fact, you're likely to have things going on that you can't hear, and that scares me, frankly. So to answer the question, what sample rate should I record at? Well, I'm a firm believer, especially if you're recording on location or for video with something like this, I'm a firm believer that 24-bit 48K is the way to go. That's going to give you the best and the most scientifically accurate results. If you disagree, then please let us know in the comments below, but let us know why. If you think 96 sounds better or 192 sounds better, don't just say 192 is the way to go and give us a thumbs down. Actually let us know why. You know, give us some evidence, give us some links to some mixes you've done or something like that. For me, 24-bit 48K all the way. Grace, what do you think?
My data analysis shows that 24-bit 48K is fine, and congratulations on not waffling for one entire video. You are, however, still a wanker.